Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Laura Podolsky. I am the Assistant Director for the UC Institute of Transportation Studies. I'm delighted you could join us today for our webinar, Accelerating the Adoption of Zero-Emission Cars in California. So a quick introduction to the UC Institute of Transportation Studies, or commonly referred to as UCITS. We are a network of faculty, researchers, administrative staff, and students who are dedicated to advancing the state of the art in transportation, engineering, planning, policy for the benefit of California and the world. We were established by the California legislature in 1947, and there are 4 branches of the ITS in the UC system. And those branches are at Berkeley, UCLA, UC Davis, and UC Irvine. So for today's webinar, this is the 3rd in a series that we're organizing for the recently released report, Driving California's Transportation Emissions to Zero. So in case you missed it, 2 weeks ago, we held our first webinar that provided an introduction to the study. And it provided also an introduction to the policy scenarios developed to set a pathway for California to achieve California neutrality in transportation. I should also mention that this study was requested through the 2019 Budget Act, and UCITS specifically was asked to identify strategies, demand-side strategies, for significantly reducing vehicle emissions and achieving carbon neutrality in transportation by 2045. So our last week, our second webinar in the series focused specifically on the fuel sector. So next slide will show that webinar and highlighted Colin Murphy and our special guest respondent, Graham Noyes. And they specifically focused on the fuel analysis section of that study, as well as the policy recommendations for the fuel sector. We also have a couple more webinars planned in this series for August and September. I hope you can join us. In August, we will be holding a webinar looking specifically at the VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, analysis and policy recommendations of the study. And then also in August, we'll be looking at the zero emission heavy duty, or medium and heavy duty trucks in California, and how do we accelerate the adoption of those innovations. And we will round out the series with a webinar scheduled for September, date to be announced, looking at the workforce implications of achieving carbon neutrality in transportation. So before we begin today's webinar, a couple housekeeping to go over very quickly. So if you run into technical issues, let us know in the chat box. If you have questions for our speakers, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You can type your question in there. Our speakers will also be typing responses. So go back and you'll see a tab on an answer tab, and you can check there to see if a speaker has responded to your question. We'll also be taking some questions live at the very end of today's webinar. Also, the webinar is being recorded today. We'll post that on the webinar's event page, and we'll include a link in a follow-up email that will be going out tomorrow. So take a look, or keep a lookout for that as well. Now, without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our speakers and guest respondents today. First, we will be hearing from Gil Tall. He is the director of the Plug-in Hybrid and Electric Vehicle Research Center at ITS Davis. In this role, he leads projects on the future need for electric vehicle infrastructure and the correlation between charging infrastructure, travel behavior, and demand for electric vehicles. Following Gil, we'll hear from Debapriya Chakraborty. She is a postdoctoral researcher at ITS Davis. Her research focuses on the impact of policies to encourage electric vehicle adoption and the role of market-based strategies in maximizing the environmental benefits of these vehicles. Then we will hear from Juan Carlos Garcia Sanchez. He is an environmental justice policy analyst at the Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and the Economy at UC Davis. His work focuses on investigating the social, economic, and health impacts of transportation decisions on historically underserved communities across California. Following our speakers today, I am pleased to be joined by two stellar guest respondents. First, we will hear from Joshua Cunningham. He is the chief of the Advanced Clean Cars branch at the California Air Resources Board. This branch develops and implements the Advanced Clean Cars regulations, the Zero Emission Vehicle regulations, and the new Clean Miles Standard. Or I'm sorry, I got that right, the new Clean Miles Standard, excuse me. His branch also manages a number of other programs to support the growth of the zero emission vehicle market, including charging and fueling infrastructure, consumer outreach, and multi-agency coordination. I'm also pleased that we were joined by Matt Alexander today. He is an air pollution specialist at the California Energy Commission. And notably, he was a primary author of the recently released assessment of the charging needs of 5 million zero-emission vehicles by 2030. This assessment was requested by AB 2127. So we do have a stellar lineup today, and I'm so excited to turn it over to Gil Tall to get us started.
Thanks, Laura. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I hope that you can see the right slide. Can someone share a thumbs up or something so that I will know that you can see my slides? And so today's presentation is our first project that was looking not on how to start the electrification of the light-duty vehicles in California, but how to electrify the last car, all the way to the last car. It's a new topic for us, started in 2019, and it has a lot of unknowns, and that's what we will talk about today. I have to say that we are focusing today on plug-in vehicles, but we fully aware to the role of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. They are part of the mix, but most of the presentation today will focus on the plug-in vehicles that will be the vast majority of the vehicles of the fleet. So in this study, it's easy. The goals are pretty well known. We need to get to a zero or a carbon neutral transportation in 2045, and that's what we are aiming for. One more point that we are aiming for is a market share of 100% ZEVs by 2035. And I'm presenting here one potential growth figure for getting from today to 2035 that was presented by Carb staff as part of the ACC2. This is, I think, the kind of best case scenario that will bring us in 2026 to already 26% or more or less around there. We are at 10% today, and will get us in more or less a straight line to 100%. A more difficult scenario will be a hockey stick, when we will have lower numbers for many years, and then we will have to climb to 100 in a much shorter period. But these numbers are given in our study. We are not challenging them. We are getting to 100%. We are getting to clean transportation by 2045. In order to get there, we need to electrify all the cars in California. One more assumption we did is that the cars that are on the road today will be here for the next 20 or 30 years, the same number of vehicles, not the same vehicles. Meaning that we are not presenting today an even better scenario with automated vehicles, with shared mobility that will reduce the need for privately owned vehicles, will reduce VMT. We are using 2020 VMT and 2020 number of vehicles. And if we look at where these vehicles are today, I think that the most important number to look at is the lowest one. 13 million vehicles today are owned by households who make less than $75,000 and live in a mix of multi-unit and single occupancy houses. And when we are talking about electrification of the entire fleet or zero emission vehicles for the entire fleet, we need to electrify the 13 million vehicles together with all the rest of them, the 8 millions that are single family, higher income, 75 to 200, and the 3 million cars that are the first to be electrified of a household that have very high income and live in single occupancy households. So what do we think will happen? Our analysis is not very good at looking at the secondary market, but we have it in the back of our mind. And if we look at today's market, most of the buyers of new electric vehicles have an income of more than 200, and some have this income of between 75 to 200, living in single family housing. That's going to be the main share of the buyers for the next 10, even 15 years. And this household will also buy the second and the third car and will create a secondary market. Only later, we will see the lower income households starting to electrify their cars, their households. And in around 2040, the amount of vehicles owned by low income household or lower income households, it's still higher than the average in California, will be higher than the amount owned by the higher income. The current owners of the 200,000 plus will stagnate at about 2 million cars just because this is the size of this fleet. So we have to remember that we are starting, the buyers of today are not going to be the same people who own these cars, who will own these cars 10 years from now. Another way to look at it, this is the entire fleet. Light duty vehicles in California, the stock, how many cars are in California? 100% of the cars. Today, 2020, we have about, we kind of model it to have about 10% electric vehicle share or sales, sorry. And every year we see the sales goes up when most of the cars are going to first-time EV adopters, but the orange one going to people who buy their second electric car. And we see more and more of that. When we get to 2030, between 2030 and 2035, only half of the new car will go to first-time EV adopters, and the other half will go to a second and third car in the household. And we're starting to see more and more cars that will go to replace an older EVs, because by 2040, many of the EVs will be 15 years old, 14 years old, and will need to be replaced. And only by, in our additional model, by 2035, we don't see 100% plug-in sales. And the rest of the 25% in this initial model will be fuel cells and still very few ICE vehicles that from different reasons will still be part of the market. As a new car that will be sold as used, car coming from other states and so on. We still have few of them, but we are reaching our goals. So I will talk on infrastructure for a few minutes. 80% of the charging needs today are covered by home charging. And that will be the case for the next 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 years, but then it will start going down. Today, we have a very strong self-selection. People who have a good home charger or the ability to charge at home, they have solar panels, some of them buy electric cars. When we move to everyone buy electric, everyone use electric, we start going down, and it will go down to 55% more or less of the charging will happen at home. It's still going to always be the most important location. The second one, which we put here as public level 2, is everything that is not your charger connected to your meter, electric meter. And it's a lot of overnight charging while you're at home and a lot of charging while you're at work, but not owned by the homeowner or by your employee, but by different public cities, private, and so on. The bottom one is walk, and we will talk a little bit more about walk because this is our real wild card on how many chargers we need and where they're going to be. So let's talk about walk for a second. The orange one at the bottom is our analysis of how many workplace chargers are absolutely necessary for all the people who buy electric car to charge them either at home or at work. So these are the chargers that people who need it will use. The top one, the gray bar or line, is this scenario that said for energy purposes to optimize our grid to use maximum amount of renewables to be able to run vehicle to grid system. We want everyone to be connected. That's the gray one at the top. And we estimated that the move to day charging, the move to vehicle to grid applications will happen gradually, and we put this blue line in the middle as the actual demand for workplace chargers. But the story is that it's somewhere between the orange line and the gray line. Okay. Now for home charging, we usually, as policymakers, think about it, it will happen by itself. But we have to remember that we are talking about electrifying the second, the third, the fourth car in the household, moving from short-range plug-in hybrid to long-range, moving to longer-range BEVs, and we're going to see much more pressure on on charging at home, on level 2 charging at home. It will be up to 10 million if we think by 2035, if we think about one charger per vehicle, but we think that it will be more at around 5.5 million chargers. And that will not happen without very, very strong infrastructure which push from the state, from the utilities to make it happen. It's way above what households and buyers will do on their own. Putting it all together, I just want to point out, there's missing here a piece of the slide that's saying that in 6-7 years from now, we will have to install between 500,000 and 1 million new chargers every year. And we're going to have a very quick peak by 2040, and then it will drop. My very kind of first take, let's start now. Let's start now and flatten this curve, not wait for the demand to show up and then install 1 million chargers a year, and then 5 years later find new jobs to these people. We should start early and flatten the curves of the installation and demand for infrastructure. And I think I actually cover most of these discussion points while going over the slide. So we need to get to lower income household. We will talk about 2+ vehicles, and that's the most important change. Home charging will be a barrier unless we will put enough policy and money on it. Workplace charging is a lot about the energy sector, and we need to good timing of the new infrastructure, so it won't be a barrier and it won't be a big peak for a few years, but a more flat demand. And I will stop here, and Priya can take over and present our TCO analysis on this topic. So you can just take my slides. I will be happy to answer clarification questions by typing in, and we will have discussion later. Okay, Priya, you can take over.
Hi, I'm Priya, and what I'm going to talk about is the cost of electrifying the light-duty vehicle fleet in California. And while Gil focused on the 2020 to 2045 period, I'll mostly just look at the 2020 to 2035. And as I would explain later as well, this is primarily because of like the data we have right now about battery costs or other fuel cost predictions. So for those reasons, I restrict my analysis to a shorter period than extending it all the way up to 2045. So why do we care about TCO or total cost of ownership? Since there's a lot of people that agree to the fact that people actually don't use this metric to buy cars. What it actually helps with is to evaluate what the cost of transition to a new technology will look like. We also know that this cost of electric vehicle adoption is not the same across households. As we can see in this picture, it's very difficult for someone who lives in an apartment to actually charge a car, or if you have multiple plug-in electric vehicles in the household, the cost may look very different than someone who just owns one. So the TCO as a tool allows us to evaluate this cost of transition for different kinds of household and identify policy tools that we will be required to ease the transition process. So what is total cost of ownership? It is primarily three components. There's the capital cost, which entails the purchase cost or the cost, as well as the cost of installation of chargers for plug-in electric vehicles. You have the operating cost, and that mainly is the fuel cost or the maintenance cost and those aspects of operating a vehicle. And then finally, there's the resale value. Now, all these components, in all these components, there are different sources of uncertainty. And as we do as we also have in this study, we evaluate the total cost of ownership and the cost of fleet electrification taking account these technology uncertainties that may impact the capital cost and the role of household characteristics, their travel behavior, as well as uncertainties that come in because of OEMs' R&D investment decisions, as well as how much they decide to pass on the cost to consumers. So that's the total cost of ownership framework, and focusing on these uncertainties and how they may impact the estimate. So first, looking at the capital cost component and the uncertainties, the primary source is for battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids is the cost of the battery technology. And the other sources, as I mentioned, is the OEM's decision and the cost of installation of home charger that may differ based on whether you live in a single family home or an apartment, or as well as the number of plug-in electric vehicles you own. But these uncertainties don't exist just for the plug-in electric vehicles, but also for gasoline cars or ICEV, the internal combustion engine vehicles in general, because there's the CAFE standards and how the implementation of these standards will impact the cost of the gasoline cars is uncertain. So there's uncertainty on both ends. And in this study, we take into account that aspect. To just demonstrate how the technology uncertainties may affect the purchase cost of the electric vehicles, we generally what we have seen in studies is taking the most optimistic scenario of battery pack cost of like somewhere between 80 to 62 kilowatt hour battery pack cost. And if we take that optimistic scenario, we do see that there will be some segments in which there may be purchase cost parity, like the BEV, the shorter range BEVs in the passenger truck segment, or the plug-in hybrids. So in this case, I would like to point out the internal combustion engine or the gasoline car price that we compare these cars to is basically the market average of the compact or the mid-size segment for the passenger car or the passenger truck, as according to what we are looking at. So we do see that if on an other hand, we had taken the maximum predictions that exist in the literature, then we may not have this purchase cost parity all the way up to maybe 2030. So these technology uncertainties play a big role in when on the total cost of ownership and when we may see a cost parity between plug-in electric vehicles and ICEVs. But along with technology uncertainties, as I mentioned, the households look different, and that may impact the cost of transition to electric vehicles. And when I say household level differences, it exists in the form of their travel demand, or as we measured by VMT, vehicle miles traveled, their access to home chargers, and in effect, their dependence on public chargers, which are generally more expensive than charging at home. The residential electricity rate that they have, at the gasoline price in the area, as well as their access to workplace chargers, which depends on their probability of using the car for commute. So there are these sources of uncertainty or heterogeneity will impact the operating cost of the vehicle and in turn the cost of transition to electric vehicles. In this study, we account for this heterogeneity by looking at the cost of transition for 6 market segments that are defined based on their dwelling type and their income. And what we account for is the difference in the vehicle miles traveled and therefore the energy cost as well as maintenance cost. We account for the difference in probability of access to level 2 chargers, as well as the probability of commute, which in turn impacts their access to workplace chargers. So finally, considering the zero emission vehicle adoption scenario that Gil described, I build on that and allocate actual vehicles to these households. So if they are a single vehicle household adopting a BEV, then they generally get a BEV passenger truck long range, which is greater than 350 miles. So we allocate these vehicles based on like what can reflect a market preference rather than any kind of a TCO minimization algorithm. So, and the vehicles are allocated between this 2020 to 2035 period based on the carbon neutrality goal. So I would like to point out that as you see, the majority of the vehicles that were allocated as this BEV passenger truck long range. And then slowly, as we move on to the later on periods, more of these short range cars, as households adopt the second or third BEV in the household, we get these shorter range passenger trucks or vehicles coming into the market, as well as the PHEV 40 miles kind of phase out, and we have more PHEV long range vehicles that enter the fleet. So this will impact what we see in the results, the capital cost parity or the TCO parity that I will present. So what we see is, because given this transition scenario that I presented in the previous slide, what we see is that the capital cost or the purchase cost of electric vehicles remain higher than ICEVs for this entire period of 2020 to 2035. And in general, what we see here that apartment dwellers have a lower cost, capital cost than single family home owners or dwellers, primarily because the cost of level 2 charger installation is much lower. We just account that they may have to bear a certain cost that is passed on by the landlord. And they don't have the cost of installing multiple chargers in case they move to the second or the third PV in the household. In case of operating cost, what we see is that it is the plug-in electric vehicles are always better than ICEVs. And the difference kind of expands further beyond 2025, when we account for the fact that there can be more vehicle-to-grid integration, more solar penetration, and the cost of workplace charging reduce drastically, as well as some of the public cost, unless it's a DC fast charger, like the level 2 charging cost may reduce. So we see that the operating cost in general is always better for plug-in electric vehicles. And finally, putting all this together, when we look at the cost of total cost of ownership, given the, again, I would like to emphasize, given the vehicle allocation scenario that we just saw, we see the TCO parity may come only in the later years, like all the way up to 2034 or 35. And that is the apartment dwellers also we see reach parity slightly earlier because they on an average had higher VMT according to the California Household Travel Survey data. Also, they have a lower cost of home charger installation, and they also enter the market later on when the cost of vehicles have fallen. There is vehicle to grid integration, so in a slightly more favorable situation altogether. And in terms of like, we looked at what share of these household segments will actually benefit from moving to plug-in electric vehicles. And what we see is that though it increases over time, it is actually never 100%. So what do we finally get is from this overall that it is not, this total cost of ownership is not a single number, and it can vary, it will vary across household segments based on their characteristics and other sources of uncertainties. The technological uncertainties and supply decisions of OEMs will have an impact on the purchase cost and thereby also on the TCO. We may need incentive support with this in the future as well, because we see that TCO parity may not be achieved in the near future. And finally, I would like to point out that unlike other TCO studies that show that the parity may be reached in the next couple of years, we do see it at like only at 2034 or 35, primarily because, as I mentioned, the allocation scenario we demonstrate here. And also we look at the entire fleet cost of fleet transition and not just a signal technology. So that's pretty much my presentation. Thank you, and I'll take questions later. Thank you. So yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Juan Carlos Garcia Sanchez. I'm the Environmental Justice Policy Analyst at the Policy Institute. What we do at the Policy Institute is we seek to inform policymakers by connecting critical energy and transportation research, and we're hoping that improves the environmental conditions for all Californians. My brief presentation will focus on the equity pieces and the equity components and some equity recommendations as far as light-duty vehicles. Go. So this was a research in partnership. I'd like to give credit to the Center for Regional Change and our small team, which focus on highlighting, as I mentioned, equity and environmental impacts for the various scenarios that will transition California to the low carbon transportation future. We also received several comments from our internal advisory group, which is a Transportation Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Group, also known as the TJAC, that helped shape some of the equity and EJ concerns and comments for this study. In addition, through a virtual community workshop, we seek to elevate the needs and concerns of various advocacy groups, special interest groups, and concerned constituents, which also help shape and address a part of the study. Looks like I skipped one. Okay, here we go. So just wanted to provide some distinction between equality and equity with this very simple and effective diagram. I want to give credit to the Robert Ward Johnson Foundation for this image. Basically, the difference between equality and equity is a difference between the several outcomes that are that are available or that emanate as a result of policy of implementing several policies. Simply because everybody has equal access to a mobility option doesn't necessarily mean equal outcomes. In this case, really addressing the unique needs and concerns of folks, particularly in the disadvantaged communities, will provide more equal outcomes. I want to also just give a very high level rundown to provide some context as far as what is contributed or what has contributed to the existing inequalities across the state. A lot of these emanate from the social determinants of health and fall under the umbrella of the social determinants of health. But we also see a history of disinvestment in disadvantaged communities, particularly communities of color. This has translated into the physical marginalization of several of these communities, particularly through infrastructure, i.e. Building freeways through various communities. And in addition, we see that these inequalities have exacerbated the lack of involvement from disadvantaged communities to really effectively contribute to the decision-making process. Ultimately, this has resulted in limited opportunities to take action on the issues that affect these communities. While we acknowledge that these structural systems are being addressed and being challenged, there's definitely a long way to go to address the root of many of these inequalities. So in this next slide, I want to provide some very high level recommendations for all of the scenarios that we presented to all the scenario teams. First and foremost, there has to be a conscious effort to provide disproportionate amount of benefits to disadvantaged communities. I want to clarify that I use the term disadvantaged communities not as a pejorative term, but rather as the way that the state defines communities that are faced with adverse environmental and social conditions. There should be also a conscious effort to prioritize input from residents and other affected communities. This has to be a critical piece to making sure that the lived experiences, community knowledge are part of the discussions and part of the solutions. On the same topic of solutions, we recognize that this is a very challenging and a challenge of severe magnitude, and really solutions that are innovative and maybe outside of the box need to be considered to address a challenge of this magnitude. These are some very kind of high level recommendations as far as equity for light duty vehicles moving forward. One of the key issues that has been kind of is just being resonated through communities and specifically low income groups has been there simply needs to be more incentives to target low income households, specifically at the point of sale for these future technologies in lieu of future rebates. So that would really reinvigorate the ability for folks to penetrate this market. Second, critical to the issue of equity is the allocation of charging infrastructure across disadvantaged communities, specifically for multi-unit dwelling and rental units. And lastly, while this isn't part of as there is a growing secondary market, specifically for battery and battery replacements. Ultimately, one of the key issues here is mitigating the environmental impacts associated with the supply chain of the production of these future mobility options. And with that, I will stop share, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions in the chat.
Great, thank you, Gil, Priya, and Juan Carlos for the presentation. I am so pleased to introduce again Joshua Cunningham and Matt Alexander as our guest respondents to react to the presentation. So Joshua, how about we hear from you first?
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me, Laura? Great. I'm very pleased to be part of this webinar. I appreciate the invitation. I'm excited to have the Air Resources Board engaged with the important research at UC Davis. And I'll start by saying this is very timely work. I recognize that some of this was driven by some of the state level legislative directives, but it is coincidental with our rulemaking efforts for electric vehicle policy changes. Just a couple of quick top level comments for why this is important context. Air Resources Board, of course, is working in a strong way to look towards all the different policy actions necessary to get towards our air quality in 2031, 2037 ozone mitigation, as well as our carbon neutrality targets in 2045. So we're working very hard to look at all the different policy angles we need to take to work towards that. And electrification is an absolute critical foundational element with a lot of different policy actions embedded in it. We are moving forward on a rulemaking now for the light duty sector for electrification, partly driven by the governor's target for 2035, which in itself is a target set on a path towards the carbon neutrality climate mitigation target. And some of our early work has come out in the mobile source strategy scenarios earlier this year. And I only mention that because that work now is building on the past work where we thought we needed 5 million ZEVs by 2030. Now the new work is showing we need probably close to 8 million, if not more. And so our partnership with the Energy Commission and the research here is really important. So just a quick final note on policy context. As part of our electric vehicle ZEV mandate rulemaking, we're moving forward on adopting new ZEV standards past 2026. There's a critical cost analysis and infrastructure analysis that we're doing now to ensure that we're informing that rulemaking, and we need to have some of those inputs and analyses done this fall to make sure we're informing that work. So I'm really excited to see the work here on capital costs for the chargers, the operating costs for electricity prices, the incremental costs for the vehicle purchase, the work that Priya is showing on how the incremental costs for vehicles can vary based on the battery range. That's really an important nuance that I think is new and innovative. And the idea that the capital cost for buying a charger is going to get a lot more complex as we work towards people that live in apartments or people that buy a second EV. So that's all new work that we're excited to look to inform our rulemaking effort. And I'll just mention 4 nuances in the weeds that I think are areas that we particularly are going to need some ideas on. One is with the apartment chargers, how many of those apartment owners are going to pay the full cost for a level 2 at that apartment complex versus portioning it to a mix of unit dwellers because of the shared infrastructure. And for apartment owners or homeowners that don't have a home charger, what is their charging behavior outside the home? Gil showed some really helpful work on how the home charging is going to go down over time at the aggregate level, and that makes sense. But I will be interested to see not just how that plays out with level 2 at the workplace, but also DC fast charging. If you have high mileage drivers that don't have access to a office job, lower income individuals may have to rely on fast charging much more frequently, like a gas station. So we need to be able to consider what the costs are for those types of fuel expenditures. And then the last note, just at a high level, the VGI comment, I saw Priya hit on that, which was helpful. That can provide an opportunity for revenue for EV drivers on their operating cost side. But that also brings you to the question of access to that. How much of that is reliant on public level 2 that has the smart capability to enable that? And then lower income individuals, are they able to access the types of EVs that can provide that functionality? So those are just some overall context to say that this research is important for the policy context that we're looking at. So if I were to just throw out 2 questions to kind of start the dialogue, one would be for Gil to further elaborate on his charge behavior topic and the fast charging, because I didn't see that in the slide there that he had, and whether the research is looking at the lower power versus higher power fast charging for long distance corridors versus urban needs. And then for Priya on the operating cost side, a nuance is, has the research started to consider some of the additional costs like taxes on fuel that's an operating cost that will eventually have to be addressed by the state on ZEVs, where they don't pay gasoline taxes right now, fees that may vary between the technologies and electricity rate growth by the utilities to pay for all their upstream investments. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that was helpful.
Thank you so much, Joshua, and good questions. I jotted those down, so hopefully we have time to get to those. So I'd love to turn it over to Matt Alexander to also comment on the presentation.
Great, thanks, Laura, and I'll echo Joshua for thanking you for having us here today. This was a really great set of presentations. And, there's a lot of parallels with the work we're doing at the California Energy Commission. I work closely with Gil on our infrastructure analysis. And as Laura was mentioning, we recently released our AB 2127 assessment, which took a slightly shorter timeline than this analysis, but we were looking at the infrastructure needs out to 2030. And we saw very similar results about just emphasizing the need for rapid scaling in infrastructure. So I'll just really highlight that. We should get started on this as soon as we can and really start building out the network to encourage EV adoption. And I'll also emphasize Gil's points about residential charging access. That's something that we've been really interested in and focused on. In our analysis, we actually did we called it an alternative future analysis to look at uncertainties based on how the evolution of the market could turn out, or different charging behaviors may play out. And we saw that residential charging access was a key determinant on the infrastructure need. And as residential charging access decreases over time, it requires a much larger public charging network. And so I think there are important implications there. Number one, just maximizing home charging as much as we can, but building out the public networks that we can support those who don't have home charging as an option. Also tying into that alternative future analysis, I really liked Gil's discussion on the work charging. I think there are a lot of important policy questions and implications that we're going to have to think through on what our goals and objectives are. We did a scenario called the EV happy hour scenario, where we really encourage charging at work during the day to soak up all of the solar generation. And out of all of our sensitivity analyses, that scenario resulted in the largest increase to the network, mostly with workplace chargers. But we did see that the load profile really aligned with solar generation. And so there's a lot of important cost benefit analysis to be done, and just thinking through what the goals are. Efforts like VGI that Joshua and others were mentioning are going to be really key moving forward. And then I also wanted to touch on Juan Carlos's presentation. The CEC is very committed to equity. We have a number of work and analysis looking at deploying charging infrastructure in an equitable manner. We've recently published an SB 1000 analysis, so that looks at how infrastructure has been disproportionately deployed in the state, and if there's differences in access for different demographics. And so, that's still an evolving analysis, but we've seen that there are challenges to overcome there and really make sure that all of the residents in California have access to charging. And I also, I really liked JC's point about innovative charging solutions. I will actually be presenting at our next business meeting in a week or two about some agreements that we're funding at the CEC to fund innovative charging solutions, specifically looking at this question of, there isn't a single silver bullet solution to charging, and different regions with different built environments and demographics are going to require unique tailored solutions for those use cases. And so I think that's a really important area that we need to focus on moving forward, and just continuing to build out the portfolio of charging solutions and making sure that we have enough options that can meet the various requirements for our residents. Beyond that, I think I'll stop there. I think Joshua asked some really good questions. I am also curious to hear about that, but Laura, I'll turn it back over to you to start the Q&A.
Great, thank you. And if all of our speakers and guest respondents, you can turn on your videos, because we'll go into open Q&A. And everyone that's listening in, type your question into that Q&A, because we'll be taking them directly from there. And so we will jump off with a question I see that Gil, that you flagged in the Q&A. Do electric car rebates work as an equity strategy? And how can the program in California be improved to address disparities in ZEV ownership? So Gil, how about we start with you, but would love to hear from others, especially Joshua and even Matt from, I know this is talking about vehicles, but with the SB 1000 analysis, there might be some thoughts there on charging as well. So Gil, would you like to take a first stab at that one?
Yeah, thanks. And I would like to kind of talk about two different things when we are talking about electric vehicle incentives and equity. First, and I think the JC was doing a really good review of the topic, we need to do much more in the coming years in order to make EVs and clean transportation in general more accessible for all communities in California. Infrastructure, overnight charging is critical for people to buy them. Incentive for used electric vehicles and make sure that the battery will will hold for longer time. Incentive for lower income to buy new cars if so, and so on. But I just want to say that the problem was not that the original incentives were not designed for equity. There is no way to start with flooding the market with high-end cars, low-end cars, expensive cars, cheap cars, new cars, and used cars at the same time. The only way to start this EV market was with expensive cars that people with high income will buy them. And from Priya's analysis and from other analysis, everyone who purchased these cars in the first years was not doing a good economical decisions. They were actually paying more for many times 80-mile range car and so on that were not great. So it was actually good for everyone in California that high-income people were the first to adopt these cars. And now we need to move to the general population. And we do need the higher income household to keep buying these cars, to buy the second, the third, to own only electric car, to sell their cars to the used car market. So our new incentive programs cannot just drop the new car buyers, which are in general higher income, and move to the rest of the population, because then we will dry this flow that we need to keep going. And we have to balance it all together. So I think that what California did was the right way to start, and now we are moving to the second phase.
I'll just
jump
augment
in,
that. I would agree with Gil's kind of the top level trajectory of the capital expenditures from the automakers drive cost reductions at the top level for the technology, and the new car buyers provide a critical funnel for those vehicles to get into the market. So all that is true. But I'll just say that in parallel to that, we have a much more complex job at the state of identifying what is the best use of the incentive dollars we have, and those incentive dollars are getting increasingly small as budgets are being used for other and broader things like forest fires and other challenges that we're wrestling with. And the size of the EV market is growing. So what do we use that dollar for a vehicle for? And everybody, I'm sure, has seen the governor's directive this year has been pushing us as an agency to focus the limited incentive dollars for EVs now going forward on a higher amount of those going to lower income buyers and particularly used car buyers. And so that is an active tension that we have on what's the best use of those public dollars that's important. Because I think pointing to Priya's work, which I'm really excited to see her work to show that the cost parity on the purchase is further out than many analysts talk about. And we agree with that because we are looking at longer range EVs. But that again creates a challenge for access for some of those longer range EVs to lower income households if they're buying new or used vehicles. And so again, the challenge is how do we best use public rebates in the near term, but knowing that those budgets are going to run out, how do we think about ensuring that those middle year buyers have a price point that work? And there's no easy answer to that.
All right, anyone else want to weigh in on this one, or we can move to our next question? All right, so I will move to our next question. Do you see the charging infrastructure ramp up as a push or pull? Industry pushing municipalities, or municipalities planning for this need? And the question goes on a little bit with cell towers, or a push in small cities, many inequities. et cetera, et cetera. So for this question on ramp up of infrastructure, I think that's the broader question here. And there was another question that Priya, I noticed that you responded to as well. Well, there are several graphs where it shows this ramp up on 2030. So what's happening there, and how do we get that ramp up? And it goes to that comment too, Gil. We're going to be needing 500,000 chargers, right, starting around that time every year for the next 8 years. And so why wait to do that? So I guess I'll open it up to this question around charging. You know, how do we increase that charging? What do we do to start now? You know, really what's needed in this space.
Sure, I guess I can start, Laura. So from the CEC side, we very much view the state as having an important role moving forward, especially in these near-term years. We've worked with local jurisdictions on planning out infrastructure needs. So we've funded blueprints for cities and regions and counties to plan electrification strategies. So we've done light duty blueprints. We've recently funded blueprints for medium and heavy duty electrification. So there very much is, you know, local planning to meet these needs. And, you know, government funding plays a big role in building out the charging infrastructure to make drivers and consumers feel comfortable purchasing an EV. And so I think we're still going to have a very big role to play moving forward. That said, we have a long-term vision of transitioning to the private market. And so I think, you know, our role is really to help get over this hump. And then, you know, over time, once the business models and utilization increases, we better, better business models for charging. I think we're going to see a lot more private investment. And that's what we expect to start phasing out our public funding.
I think that it's important that a different part of the study showed that in general, our investment in clean transportation will have a net benefit return, that in the long run, we're actually going to save money for society, for the state of California, by moving to a clean transportation. But we need to make a huge investment to start this thing. And I think that infrastructure is the kind of number one place when you see this investment coming first, and then the return on the investment is going to be long term. And we need to make sure that the investment is coming from the same agencies that can then benefit from it later. So if the question was, is it going to be municipalities? I'm not sure that municipalities need to put the most of the investment. It can be the state, it can be utilities, it can be private sector, but it's this game of investing now and having a very long term in return on this investment. And we are still struggling with it. It's a good question. Mm-hmm.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. One just came in, and then we'll have to wrap up. But so the question that came in is, so if we are going to encourage, you know, the all ZEV sales to be ZEVs in California, or all new car sales to be ZEVs, you know, what about people going to nearby states and buying their internal combustion engine vehicle? So what thought has been put into that, and was it captured in your analysis, Gil and Priya? And I also see Joshua has an answer too.
Yeah, I'll certainly welcome the researchers to kind of chime in. From a policy standpoint, there are some limits in place for a buyer to bring a vehicle that is new across state lines and register it in the state of California. So there are some limits there to try and dissuade that activity, but it is something we'll have to keep an eye on and possibly change some of the rules longer term to minimize that risk. But hopefully, if Priya's work is correct, that the incremental costs eventually come down and everybody accesses the electricity savings, then that behavior is minimized once we get to that cost parity point. But the cost parity is not, you know, immediately. So that's certainly something we need to keep our eye on.
Yeah, we haven't touched it in our study. I think that the question of, for example, 0-mile used cars floating from other states into California, or close to new cars that are coming is very important. In general, we believe it will be much harder to achieve 100% without the rest of the country. Other states are getting in similar trajectory, even not 100, but on a similar trajectory. It will be hard for California to be an island of ZEVs if the rest of the states will stay on very, very low percentage.
All right. Well, thank you. We have more questions in the queue. We didn't get to your questions, Joshua, but there's so much to talk about on the subject. We try to cram a lot in an hour. I know we're ambitious. The state's goals for ZEVs is ambitious. So I guess that's just the nature of things. So at this time, I would just really love to thank our speakers. Thank you so much for joining us today, your presentations. Thank you for our guest respondents. Thank you, Joshua and Matt, for joining us. And thank you for everyone out there who hung in with us. If you can take a moment and respond to our evaluation survey, we'll pop that in the chat. It will also be up on your screen when we end today's webinar. So please tell us what you thought of today's webinar. What did you like? What can we do to improve future webinars? And I hope you join us for the additional webinars in this series, and we'll make sure you have all those dates in the follow-up email that goes out today. So with that, I'm closing our webinar today, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.